So Kirby Krogstad received his bachelor's degree from South Dakota State University and his master's from the University of Nebraska, where he conducted nutrition research with dried distillers grains. He's currently a PhD student under the direction of Dr. Barry Bradford at Michigan State University, and he's interested in nutrition and health interactions. Today, Kirby will be discussing feeding pelleted DDGS with low and high forage diets, and you are welcome to start.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I want to thank the sponsors and the committee for putting together a really nice event. But I guess to start, the slides are red, but the polo's green, so I am going to step back in time a little bit here to talk about work I did in Lincoln, where we did feed pelleted or meal distillers grains with different forage concentrations. First thing I always like to start off with is we always have to realize how integrated agriculture is, and ethanol is as integrated as anything into animal agriculture. Yearly production of ethanol is about around 60 billion liters, and the corn, or of our total corn harvest every year, about 38% of that is used for ethanol production. This ethanol production leads to roughly 10 million tons of DDGS fed to dairy cattle annually. So the other interesting item that has come up with distillers grains in the last few years is pelleting feeds. So when we're pelleting our feeds, or there's a distillers mill that started to pellet their feeds without the addition of any binders or feed additives, and they wanted to know, does pelleting the feed change its behavior? And as we're digging through the literature, we'll see that pelleting may actually influence digestibility. In a study in 2019, they found that when they fed 3 forms of oats in a total mixed ration to dairy cows, they were flaked, pelleted, or rolled, as you can see in the graph. Pelleted oats, pardon me, in this case, improved total track NDF digestibility. So that's just something to think about as we move forward through my data to see if that was a consistent response. The other part of this that I always like to think about is forage supply and forage quality. Recently, forage supply has been a challenge. Like I said, I spent the last couple of years of my academic life in Nebraska, and we had some tragic, dramatic floods that really did some damage to a lot of farmers, their forage supplies, their livestock inventory. So it was a really challenging time. But what I love about our industry is how quickly research has responded with more research on alternative forages and forage concentrations in total mixed rations. So I think we need to realize this challenge of forage quality and quantity isn't going away. Precipitation patterns will continue to be variable. Temperature patterns will continue to be variable with more flood and drought periods. And so this could reduce our forage supplies and reduce our forage quality at the same time. So we need to continue to investigate low forage feeding strategies. So with that background, I wanted to evaluate whether feeding a pelleted distillers or a meal distillers with low or high forage diets, being 45 or 55% forage, affected any animal performance or digestibility. And also our hypothesis was that feeding the pelleted distillers would not affect any of our variables of interest, but that increasing forage would reduce passage rate, which would then increase digestibility and milk production. So to test this, we had a simple design. It was just 7 rumen cannulated cows. So keep that in mind, 7 cows. So we had small numbers, but 7 cows in a crossover design where we fed them for 21 days. And then on day 21, we did a rumen sampling every 2 hours over 24 hours to get pH, ammonia, and VFA concentrations. And then on the following week, we measured body weight at the beginning and end of the period, dry matter intake, milk production, and fecal collections were done daily. We also collected sorting and rumination data, as well as rumen evacuations, which are pictured here, one of the messier jobs I've ever undertaken, to get passage rate information. So the diets were, by design, quite similar. The low forage diets are here on the left. The high forage diets are here on the right. With our ingredient composition in the top half of the table, you'll see our low forage were about 45% forage, and the high forage were 55%. Within that, you'll see the meal and pelleted distillers are the only differences, with 15% from the meal or 15% from the pelleted, depending on the respective diet. I want to jump down to the chemical composition, though, just to demonstrate one thing. The chemical composition is nearly identical. Our crude protein was 16.7, starch was about 24, and then the fatty acids were at 5%. even NDF on its own was nearly identical, but within NDF, we have to think about the digestibility of those sources. So our low forage diets had increased amounts of beet pulp and soybean hulls, so they had increased fiber digestibility. So although NDF was the same, the type of NDF we fed was not. And additionally, the meal and pelleted distillers did exhibit some interesting differences. Now, these aren't statistically analyzed, and you'll see some variability, so you should take these results with a grain of salt, but they're a part of the larger picture. 30-hour digestible NDF was increased for the pelleted DDGS, going from 70.4% of NDF to 73.9%. This is also supported by the fact that the pelleted distillers had a reduced lignin concentration. It's important to say both of these distillers came from the same production batch. Basically, the corn, the processing was all the same. And then at the end, the pelleted DDGS just went through the additional step of being pelleted. So they are from the same production batch. So this change in nutrient concentration is something to do with the pellets, the pelleting. So jumping into our data, I'm going to show you 3 graphs, and they are all going to be formatted the same with low forage on the left, high forage on the right, meal in red, and pelleted distillers in gray. So increasing forage did slow passage rate as we hypothesized, as you can see here, going from about 2.8 to about 2.6% per hour. But did that lead to an improvement in digestibility for the high forage diets? It did not. Our apparent total track NDF digestibility actually exhibited a very similar response to that seen by the TOSTA study where they fed oats. When we feed the pelleted distillers, we see about a 2.5 unit increase in total track NDF digestibility. Interestingly enough, the increase in fiber digestibility coupled with a numerical increase in protein digestibility leads to an increase in total track energy digestibility when feeding the pelleted DDGS. So there's some evidence here that demonstrates pelleting feed may increase the digestibility and energy that that animal is getting from that feed. When we get down to it though, milk production was largely similar. Energy corrected milk wasn't different across treatments. There was a response in protein yield for each treatment, but I don't want to draw too much into that. As I said, we had a really small number of cows, and to test the production measures, I would like to do a study with similar diets, but with much larger numbers. So really my final thoughts, pelleting may improve digestibility when you couple the past data, our data, and then the in vitro results we saw. I think it's becoming clearer, but obviously you have to couple the decision with pelleting feed with the cost of pelleting. Also, using non-forage fiber is useful in low forage strategies like soybean hulls and beet pulp that can balance your NDF concentration, keep starch from getting out of control. Also, the inclusion of straw and high forage diets did slow passage rate, which could be a tool if you're having a lot of loose stools and some high cow pens or anything like that. And additionally, I just wanted to list a few recommendations. Is number one, when you're feeding byproducts, know the source of the byproduct, especially DDGS, because if you eliminate the plant, or if you get all of your DDGS from one source, the variability will be much, much lower than getting distillers from many different sources. Additionally, when we're thinking about these low forage diet formulations, I think there's 2 things to pay attention to. First being watching our unsaturated fat concentration. The breakpoint I list is less than 3% of the diet dry matter. There are ranges from 2.5 to 3.5 depending on who you ask, but generally speaking, 3% is a good breakpoint, but less is better. And also the measure I like to look at now, especially when I'm balancing diets, is starch plus sugar plus NDFD30. I think we have to pay attention to the fermentability of that fiber along with the other fermentable carbohydrates. And I would say if you sum these together, all on a dry matter basis, less than 42% would be a good benchmark to have when looking at these low forage formulations. So I tried to be brief, and I hope that there are some questions. And if not, I look forward to the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. I do have a question about pelleting. So like distillers grains don't have a big particle size to begin with. So some of the benefit of pelleting is grinding prior to pelleting. So what do you think is actually happening during the pelleting process that improves digestibility? What are your thoughts around that?
It's interesting. After exploring some of the literature, I actually dove into cellulosic ethanol papers, and they often use pressure and steam to improve the fiber digestibility of corn stover. And so when you're pelleting, you're conditioning the feed to about 80 degrees Celsius, or depending on what your settings are, and then you're applying a great amount of pressure to push that through a screen. So I think something in the combination of the steam and the pressure is breaking down the lignin bonds in the fiber matrix. And I think that might be making the fiber more accessible, leading to a slight increase in the fiber digestibility. I do want to conduct one big in vitro study on a bunch of feeds that have been pelleted or not to see if that's consistent. But I think it's an interesting question to ask.